The late November wind bit at my cheeks as Linda and I walked up the stone path leading to our daughter's grand suburban home. The place looked like something out of an architectural magazine. 3 stories of glass, steel, and white marble. Perfectly trimmed hedges lined the driveway, and cars worth more than my entire retirement fund glittered beneath the security lights. "Andrew," Linda whispered, her hand clutching my arm, "be on your best behavior. Please, it's Thanksgiving." I gave a soft chuckle. When have I ever not been? But she didn't laugh. Her eyes lingered on the front door, on the life our daughter now belonged to, one that no longer had space for the simple professor and his wife. We rang the bell, and almost immediately, Mark, Sarah's husband, appeared. Tall, perfectly groomed, every inch the successful businessman. "Andrew, Linda, so glad you could make it," he said, his smile polished like the cufflinks on his wrists. He shook my hand, firm, practiced, soulless, and led us into a living room glowing with gold tones and expensive art. 40 guests. I counted them quietly. 40 strangers in my daughter's house. They filled the space with laughter and chatter, champagne glasses in hand. None of them looked like they knew who we were, the aging couple standing awkwardly by the coat rack. Then she appeared. Sarah, my only daughter. She looked radiant in a navy blue silk dress, her hair swept into an elegant twist. For a moment my heart swelled with pride. That was my little girl. But when she kissed my cheek, it was brief, cold, formal. "Dad, Mom," she said politely, "leave your coats upstairs. Dinner will be ready soon." Her tone stung more than it should have. I wasn't her father in that moment. I was a guest on a list, a formality to be checked off. Linda squeezed my hand as we climbed the stairs to hang our coats. "She's just nervous," she murmured, trying to convince herself. "All these important people." But I could feel it, that invisible wall between us, built over 2 years since she married Mark Chase and became part of the Chase empire. When we came down, the dinner table looked like something out of a royal banquet. A golden turkey glistened under chandelier light, surrounded by silver dishes of delicately plated sides. Bottles of wine stood like trophies, their labels foreign to me but clearly expensive. Sarah and Mark sat at the center, flanked by Mark's father, Stephen Chase, the man whose shadow stretched over this entire house. He was around my age but carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Slick silver hair, tailored Italian suit, a gold watch that caught the light every time he gestured. Stephen commanded the room effortlessly. He talked about his latest real estate ventures, a new skyscraper in Chicago, a resort opening in Florida. His stories sparkled with the kind of numbers that made people's jaws drop. Millions, tens of millions, billions. The guests laughed, toasted, hung on every word. I sat quietly beside Linda at the far end of the table, nodding when spoken to, sipping my wine too slowly. My world had been built on ideas, books, students, and the satisfaction of seeing young minds awaken to literature. Here that meant nothing. Here success had a dollar sign. Every now and then I caught Sarah's gaze on Stephen, admiration shining in her eyes. The same admiration she used to have for me when I'd take her to the library, when we'd stay up reading together. That memory flickered in my mind, and it hurt more than I cared to admit. Then came dessert, Linda's apple pie, the same recipe Sarah had begged for every year as a child. She'd made it again just for this night, hoping it might bring some warmth to the evening. But the warmth died the moment a man named Albert, one of Mark's business partners, decided to open his mouth. "Education is great," Albert said, raising his glass, "but in the end what counts is business instinct. Take Stephen, for example, no college degree, but look what he's built, a real empire." Laughter. Stephen smiled modestly. "Well, Albert, let's not be too harsh on education. It has its place. Though in my experience, college teaches you theory. Life teaches you how to make money." More laughter. Even Sarah smiled. I forced a polite grin, though my jaw ached from it. I'd spent nearly 4 decades teaching literature, guiding students through Shakespeare and Dostoevsky, helping them find meaning beyond the material. I'd believed that knowledge was power, that ideas changed lives. Now it felt like all those years had been reduced to a joke. Then Sarah spoke. Her voice was calm, confident, but the words that came next sliced through me like a blade. "It's true," she said. My father was a university professor his whole life, very respectable, very noble. But the reality is, my father-in-law makes in 1 month what my father made in 10 years. That's the difference between success and failure, between someone who understands the real world and someone who lives in theories. Silence fell, absolute suffocating silence. 40 guests all staring at me. I felt Linda's hand trembling beside mine. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My chest felt hollow, my throat dry. Stephen looked at me with that smug, satisfied smile, the expression of a man who knew he'd just won something intangible. I lowered my eyes to the tablecloth, pretending to adjust my fork, hiding the shame that burned behind my glasses. That night, under the glittering chandeliers and fake smiles, I realized something I should have known long ago. I had raised my daughter to chase truth, integrity, and wisdom. But in her world, none of that mattered anymore. And for the first time in 62 years, I felt small, but I wouldn't stay that way for long. The next morning, the cold November sunlight spilled through the thin curtains of our small home. Dust motes floated in the air like ghosts, faint, forgotten, quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched coffee. The apple pie Linda had packed to bring back sat on the counter, still wrapped, uneaten. Linda moved slowly around the kitchen, her silence saying more than words could. Finally, she stopped, turned to me, and said softly, "She didn't mean it that way, Andrew. She was just nervous, showing off for her husband's family." I didn't answer, because I knew that wasn't true. Sarah had meant every word. The tone in her voice, the calmness in her eyes. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been judgment. "I spent my life teaching her that kindness mattered more than money," I said at last, my voice dry and bitter. "Now she's learned to measure worth in dollars instead of decency." Linda sighed. "You gave her everything. You can't blame yourself for who she's become." But I did. I blamed myself more than anyone. After breakfast, Linda went to the garden, pruning her roses. I went into my study, the smallest room in the house. Shelves lined with books from a life that now felt like another era, the Odyssey, The Great Gatsby, Crime and Punishment. I ran my fingers along the spines. These books had been my companions, my purpose. They had shaped generations of students. And yet none of it seemed to matter anymore, not in a world ruled by bank accounts and business cards. I sat at my old oak desk, opened my laptop, and stared at the blinking cursor on a blank page. For the first time in years, I wanted to write. Not about literature, about life. About how easy it was to lose the people you love to the illusion of success. But after typing 2 lines, I stopped. What was the point? Who would read the words of a washed-up professor who couldn't even earn his daughter's respect? Days passed in a fog. Linda tried to talk to Sarah on the phone, but our daughter's responses were short, polite, empty. "We're busy with business events, Mom. Maybe next month." Next month never came. On one particularly sleepless night, I went to the living room and turned on the television. A financial news channel blared through the speakers. Stephen Chase was being interviewed. His silver hair gleamed under studio lights as he discussed his latest real estate triumph. The ticker below his name read, "Net worth, $480 million. I stared at his face, that same smug expression I'd seen at Thanksgiving. The man my daughter admired. The man who'd humiliated me without saying a word. And then, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel anger. I felt curiosity. What made this man so powerful? What made him more valuable in the eyes of the world than a lifetime of teaching and shaping minds? I realized I didn't understand the world Sarah lived in. Not truly. I had spent my life immersed in poetry, not profits. That night I made a decision. Quiet, deliberate, and absolute. I wouldn't let my story end as a man left behind. I might not build an empire like Stephen Chase, but I would build something. Something my daughter couldn't dismiss with a comparison. So I started reading again. But not literature this time. Finance, business, entrepreneurship. The same way I had once studied Shakespeare's sonnets, I now devoured books about investment strategies, market behavior, real estate, and publishing trends. Linda watched me from the doorway one night, concerned. "Andrew, what are you doing up at 3 a.m. again?" Learning, I said simply. Something I should have done a long time ago. At first, it was overwhelming. All the jargon, all the risk. But there was one thing I understood better than most. People. I had spent 40 years studying human nature through novels and students' eyes. The same instincts that helped me analyze characters in Dostoevsky were helping me now read between the lines of business negotiations and corporate behavior. A week later, I sold my old first edition book collection, the one I'd kept for decades. Linda protested, but I told her gently, "They've taught me all they can. It's time they teach someone else." The money wasn't much, but it was a start. I opened a small online freelance profile offering writing and editing services. At first, it was just academic help, memoir editing for retirees, letters for small nonprofits. Then one day, I received a request from a young CEO who needed a ghostwriter for his autobiography. He wanted depth, intelligence, and humanity in his book, something that sounded different from typical business bragging. I took the job. For weeks, I worked tirelessly, crafting his life story not as a record of profits, but as a journey of lessons learned through failure and sacrifice. When the book was published, it exploded in popularity. The CEO called me, his voice full of gratitude. "You gave my story a soul, Andrew. I owe you everything." The irony wasn't lost on me. A man who measured life in money was thanking a man who once lived only in words. More projects followed. More CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs who wanted their stories told right. I began earning more in a month than I had in years as a professor. But this time, it wasn't about money. It was about meaning, about proving that even theory, when wielded with wisdom, could outlast the arrogance of power. Every night I kept a notebook. My second education, I called it. Inside I wrote, "Respect isn't given, it's rebuilt." And somewhere deep inside, beneath the calm surface of my new work, a quiet fire was growing. The fire of a father who would, one day soon, remind his daughter what real success looked like. Months passed, and the quiet hum of my small home became the rhythm of a new life. The same house that had once felt like a sanctuary of memories now smelled faintly of ink, printer paper, and ambition. My mornings began with coffee and spreadsheets instead of lectures, and evenings ended with emails from clients instead of late-night grading. I had become a different kind of teacher, one who instructed through words on a page rather than spoken lectures in a classroom. I started taking small steps at first, editing memoirs, rewriting bios, ghostwriting letters. My fingers, once accustomed to turning the delicate pages of first editions, now flew across a keyboard, crafting sentences that would one day appear on the shelves of luxury bookstores, whispered about on private jets, and cited in business magazines. Every project added to my reputation, quietly, carefully, almost invisibly. And yet, the fire that had been lit that Thanksgiving night never faded. I kept thinking of Sarah, of her words slicing through my dignity. My father-in-law makes in 1 month what my father made in 10 years. I had carried that sentence in my chest like a weight, letting it guide me, shape me. One day, a client called, a wealthy entrepreneur looking to publish a memoir. He wanted someone who could make his story feel authentic, who could convey the lessons behind the millions he had earned. I accepted immediately, knowing that this was my first real opportunity to step into the world I had been excluded from. Weeks turned into months. I poured my soul into his book. I studied him, watched interviews, read every word he had ever written in public. I captured his ambition, his failures, his fears, and more importantly, I infused the narrative with wisdom, subtle lessons on life and human nature. When it was published, it soared to the top of bestseller lists. Word spread fast. Other CEOs, venture capitalists, and business magnates came knocking. They wanted the same magic I had woven into that first memoir. A voice that could make their triumphs sound meaningful, their struggles relatable, their wealth seem like more than just numbers. Meanwhile, my own investments began to grow. I had learned the basics of finance, yes, but my edge came from observation, from understanding psychology, from knowing how people thought and what they wanted to hear. I quietly moved money into low-risk ventures, then into higher stakes as my confidence grew. Within a year, I was making more than I had ever earned as a professor, and yet I didn't flaunt it. I didn't post pictures of luxury watches or fancy cars. My success was silent, strategic, patient. It was a chess game, and I was thinking 10 moves ahead. One evening, while reviewing a draft for a new client, Linda came into my study. She had that soft, knowing smile she always wore when she saw me focused, alive. "Andrew," she said, "I think you found your second life." I looked up at her, tired but determined. "Not just a second life," I said. "A second chance." The next months were a blur of success. Every book I ghostwrote hit bestsellers. The CEOs' names were everywhere, but no one knew who had written their stories. That anonymity suited me perfectly. It wasn't about recognition. It was about power. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need applause, but commands respect. I also started networking carefully, not with the socialites who had once humiliated me, but with people who were intelligent, ambitious, and ethically sound. I learned to spot weaknesses in deals, opportunities in overlooked ventures, and slowly, deliberately, I began to build a financial foundation that could rival even the empire of a man like Stephen Chase. Every night before bed, I would jot down notes in my leather journal, ideas for new books, potential partnerships, investments. Occasionally, I would write a line or two about Sarah, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. The words she had spoken that Thanksgiving night would never leave me, but they had become fuel rather than poison. I imagined the day I might return to her world, not as the old, quiet professor she had dismissed, but as someone she couldn't ignore, someone who had learned that life, like literature, could be rewritten. And in that imagining, a sense of calm satisfaction settled over me. I wasn't the man Sarah thought I was. I was better, stronger, smarter. The foundation for the ultimate chapter of my life was being built silently, meticulously, in the shadows of the one I had lost. The professor had become a strategist. The quiet man had become unstoppable. And I knew, very soon, my second chapter would intersect with hers, and the world she had embraced would be reminded of the man she had almost forgotten. Thanksgiving arrived again, exactly 1 year after the night that had changed everything. The chill in the November air was sharper than before, but this time I didn't feel small or out of place. I was no longer the retired professor who had been humiliated in front of 40 strangers. I had become someone else entirely, someone who had learned how to navigate the world Sarah now inhabited. Linda and I arrived at her house precisely at 7 p.m., just like the year before. The driveway was crowded with luxury cars. The garage doors opened to reveal high-end vehicles polished to perfection. The front entrance gleamed under a wreath of fresh pine and twinkling lights. Inside, the house buzzed with the chatter of business elites, socialites, and family friends. 40 familiar faces, all elegantly dressed. Mark greeted us warmly, but there was a hint of unease behind his practiced smile. I noticed the stiffness in his handshake, subtle but noticeable. "Andrew, Linda," he said, his tone polite but tight. "Glad you could join us again." Sarah appeared shortly after, resplendent in an emerald green gown that shimmered under the chandelier lights. She hugged me lightly, a gesture that was polite, but something inside me told me it wasn't the cold distance of last year. Perhaps she sensed the change. Perhaps she had begun to see the man I had become. Dinner was a lavish affair, more extravagant than the previous year. The golden turkey gleamed like a centerpiece of pride, accompanied by sides that could have fed an army, wines imported from the most exclusive vineyards, and desserts that were more art than food. The room was alive with conversation, business deals, and laughter, but I observed quietly, analyzing, calculating, waiting. Stephen Chase was at the head of the table, commanding attention as always. He spoke of new acquisitions, expansions, and investment strategies. But this time there was an unusual tension in the air. A few of his colleagues glanced nervously at their phones, whispering and exchanging furtive looks. Midway through dessert, a message was discreetly passed to one of the guests. Within minutes, the atmosphere shifted. People who had laughed and toasted moments ago now leaned forward in hushed urgency. Stephen's confident smile faltered for the first time in my memory. I leaned back, observing quietly. Mark's company, the very empire that had elevated Sarah and stolen her admiration, was under federal investigation. Tax discrepancies, fraudulent accounts, and unethical practices were now being exposed. Some of the investors were furious, and the room buzzed with restrained panic. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile triumphantly. I simply sat there, calm and composed, feeling the satisfaction that comes not from revenge, but from justice. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide, searching for an explanation. "Dad," she whispered, almost under her breath. I reached over, placing my hand over hers, steady and reassuring. "Sometimes, Sarah," I said softly, "the lessons from theory are what keep you from falling in the real world." Her gaze lingered on me. For the first time in years, I saw something flicker. Recognition. Respect. Perhaps even a hint of awe. She realized that the man she had dismissed as a professor who lived in theories had quietly mastered the very world she had chosen to embrace. The night continued, but the balance had shifted. Conversations that once revolved around money, success, and prestige were now tinged with caution and awareness. Stephen tried to regain control, but the tension was palpable. Even Mark's usual composure wavered, and I noted the subtle anxiety in his posture. Linda squeezed my hand gently, a silent acknowledgement of what had transpired. I smiled faintly, feeling the warmth of victory that required no arrogance, no shouting, no humiliation. My life had always been about subtlety, patience, and wisdom, and tonight, those qualities had proven more powerful than wealth alone. As we left the house later that night, Sarah walked beside us, hesitant. "Dad," she said quietly, I didn't understand. I didn't see what you had all these years." I nodded, keeping my expression gentle. "It's okay, Sarah. You're learning now. That's what matters." Walking back to our car, I realized that this Thanksgiving wasn't about proving my worth to strangers or even to my daughter. It was about reclaiming dignity, showing that true respect isn't measured in dollars or titles, but in resilience, intelligence, and the ability to rise above humiliation. For the first time in decades, I felt fully seen, fully alive. And deep inside, I knew that the final chapter of this story, the one where family, respect, and love were restored, was yet to be written. The first light of dawn spilled into our home the morning after Thanksgiving. The air smelled faintly of smoke from the fireplace and the lingering aroma of Linda's apple pie, which we had reheated for breakfast. The world outside felt still, almost reverent, as if it too recognized the shift that had taken place the night before. Sarah hadn't called yet, but I didn't expect her to. She was still processing the collapse of Mark's empire, the humiliation her father-in-law had suffered at the hands of federal scrutiny, and most importantly, the revelation of who I had become. It was a lot for anyone to absorb, let alone someone who had dismissed me so casually just a year ago. I poured coffee into 2 mugs, carrying one to the living room where Linda was already seated, her eyes bright and hopeful. "Do you think she'll reach out?" she asked. I shrugged, though my mind was already turning over the events of the previous night. "Eventually. She needs to understand something first, that success is not about money or titles or the approval of others. It's about resilience, integrity, and the choices you make when no one is watching." We ate in silence for a while, comforted by the simplicity of our home and the warmth of routine. The past year had been transformative. My ghostwriting business had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. CEOs and entrepreneurs I had worked with privately were now reading and recommending books I had written under pseudonyms. My income had quietly surpassed even Stephen Chase's monthly ventures. But the greatest victory wasn't financial. It was moral, intellectual, personal. Around mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Sarah standing there, her eyes tired but earnest. She carried nothing but a small envelope in her hand, which she extended toward me. I don't know how to start," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I've spent so long chasing a life that I thought mattered, and I ignored the one person who truly shaped me. You." I took the envelope, opening it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dad, I see now what I didn't understand. Your life, your work, your sacrifices. They were never about money. They were about love, guidance, and integrity. I'm sorry for everything I said and felt that night. I want to learn from you again." Her words hit me with a force I hadn't expected. After decades of sacrifice, of feeling invisible in a world obsessed with wealth, my daughter was finally seeing me, truly seeing me. I reached out and took her hand, feeling the warmth that had been absent from our relationship for too long. "Sarah," I said softly, "it's never too late. Come in. Let's start again." We sat together in the living room, Linda beside us, and talked for hours. Sarah asked questions about my work, about the books I had written, the people I had met, and the lessons I had learned in the past year. She listened intently, her admiration no longer reserved for strangers or business titans, but directed toward the man who had raised her, loved her, and quietly reinvented himself. I shared stories of my students, of the lives I had touched, and of the wisdom that comes from decades spent teaching and learning. She laughed, she cried, and sometimes she simply held my hand in silence. The distance that had once seemed insurmountable was shrinking with every word, every shared memory. Later that afternoon, we baked an apple pie together, just like we had when she was a child. Flour dusted the countertops and laughter echoed through the kitchen. It was ordinary, yet perfect, a quiet celebration of connection, healing, and understanding. By evening, Sarah stayed for dinner. Not the extravagant formal affair at the Chase estate, but a simple meal at our modest table. The difference was palpable. There were no strangers to impress, no lavish foods or intimidating guests, only family, warmth, and respect. She looked at me, across the table, eyes filled with sincerity. "Dad," she said, "I'm proud of you. Not for the money, not for the business success, for you, for everything you are." I smiled, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that had been there since that first humiliating Thanksgiving. "Thank you, Sarah. That's all I ever wanted. To be seen, to be understood. And now you do." As the sun set over our little home, the past year of struggle, reinvention, and quiet triumph felt complete. The lesson was clear. Dignity, perseverance, and love can outlast arrogance, wealth, and superficial admiration. For the first time in decades, I felt whole. And more importantly, so did my family. We shared Linda's apple pie, and as Sarah laughed at a small joke, I realized that the story of humiliation, reinvention, and redemption had reached its natural conclusion. Not with revenge, but with understanding. Not with wealth, but with love. And in that warmth I knew we were finally home.